Hey, can everybody hear me?
Yep.
There we go. Uh, Somehow Microsoft Teams has started stealing my microphone, and putting it on some fake virtual device that doesn't do anything. Um, anyway, it's 3 after. This is when we normally start. So thanks everyone for joining the Tuesday, April 2nd SIG Multicluster meetup. Stephen, I believe you are first on the agenda.
Yep. Yeah, since everyone wasn't at KubeCon, I thought I would just give a brief summary of the discussion around credentials in the cluster inventory. So that I just pasted the link in the agenda to the shared documents where I took notes. But the general consensus was, at least as I understood it, yeah, Justin isn't on the call, but so, and I see, all right, oh yeah, Tim is there as well. So the main drivers were really trying to find something, trying to reach a consensus that would allow concrete unblocking, in particular for Q, on top of what was already in the cluster inventory spec, which specified, well, for example, a provider field, and also taking into account Tim's comments on what he would say when this came across his desk for API review. And so we ended up saying that, well, those of us who were there ended up agreeing that we wanted spec fields, so not status fields or status key value pairs, but spec fields for a provider, which might be different from the cloud provider specified elsewhere, because this is really an authentication provider. A list of endpoints, well, really we want two to allow endpoint rollovers. So if your endpoints change IP addresses, for a little while, you'll end up having two endpoints in the cluster inventory, and that means that clients would have to try both until they find one that works. And an object reference to the secret, which would be a secret name and a secret type. And that's really treated as an opaque reference, effectively. Yeah, Tim.
Sorry, do you think you're presenting, or are you just talking through it?
Just talking through it.
Okay.
But it might be useful if I presented. Yeah, yeah. Because it was just the docs. I'll share the document. It might be easier for folks to. Oh, there we go. So it's this part here, really. Was all that mattered. So any comments, things that I'm misrepresenting, objections? Yeah. Tim again.
Sorry, I forgot to put it down.
All right, okay. Oh, it came back up. That's yeah, it was weird.
Seems reasonable.
Yeah. Okay, well, I guess we need to write it up as a PR for the KEP. So I'll take care of that. And next up are Jack and John. I'll stop sharing.
Cool, thanks. Jeremy, do I need permission to share my screen, or should I be able to do that?
You should have it.
Yeah, okay, cool. All right. So let me get this going here. All right. So yeah, I made a pretty simple controller POC that manages inventory cluster objects based on cluster API clusters. So basically the way this is intended to work is you create a cluster API cluster, an inventory cluster gets created for you automatically. And then kind of as that cluster API cluster mutates and changes state and those kinds of things, those will get automatically reflected back into the inventory cluster. And then when the cluster API cluster is deleted, then the inventory cluster also gets deleted. So I can show how this works. So I have a cluster up and running here with all the bits necessary. So this is a command to create a cluster API cluster. And I will start a watch on inventory clusters. And we can see that when the cluster API cluster gets created, we see that cluster, and then also an inventory cluster gets created. And this group name is obviously wrong. We will fix that. But yeah, I can do that again with another cluster and see that as this new cluster gets created, we also see another inventory cluster. And then if I delete one of these clusters, then after this cluster is gone, we also see the inventory cluster also get deleted. So that's pretty cool. So this is what the actual inventory cluster looks like. So we are using the generate name field when we create these, just like the KEP describes. And so the ultimate name of this is named with the provider name, which is cluster API, and then the cluster API cluster name, and then the random suffix that automatically gets added. And then this display name also matches the cluster API name. So yeah, that's pretty much it. So hopefully this kind of helps give an idea of how we could integrate inventory clusters with the various providers in the ecosystem. Does anybody have any questions? I have not been looking at chats. I will catch up on that.
No, I just want to say this is a really great demo. I mean, thank you, John and Jack, for doing this, because we've been discussing the cluster inventory API for a while now, and the provider has always been some of the CNCF projects, but now having cluster API inside the SIG, which is closely aligned with our own SIG cluster inventory API project, to have an integration in this space is great. Thank you so much.
Cool, yeah, thanks. I think Tim was next.
So I admit that I sort of looked away. I've been busy the last few months and not super paying attention. Are we locked in on this being non-namespaced? The reason I ask is we tried this similar approach before and decided that going to namespaced was actually really important. And it was important because then people could share a control plane across multiple groups of clusters. I believe it was Red Hat, but I don't want to point fingers, who made an argument that having this be namespaced was actually a really critical property of the cluster registry effort.
Yeah, I don't know if I am clued in on that discussion. Mike, do you have any insight there?
Tim, you are absolutely correct, and you call out Red Hat correctly. We do have a preference, and I'm gonna bring up that discussion of namespace versus cluster scope discussion after more discussion here, because yeah, there are some advantages and disadvantages of that, of course. So the reason we didn't define it in the CAP initially is because we designed this API not to be only specific to Kubernetes CRD. So in the sense that this API can be some cloud service API, etc. So in that sense, having a namespace or cluster scope in that field doesn't make sense. But yes, I will share a doc and we can discuss more on the namespace versus cluster scope. Wilson.
Okay, thanks. I apologize for sort of taking my eye off the ball. What you said about trade-offs is exactly right. I can think of a lot of things we might build on top of this that would be better with namespace, and some that would be worse with namespace.
Yeah, thanks, John, for the demo. It is great to see a baseline implementation here, but yeah, maybe we should go into that conversation, because I think that seems pretty core to positioning moving forward. And yeah, maybe it starts with a follow-up doc, or it looks like we have that follow-up doc. Okay. John, if there's nothing else, should we move on to Mike, and maybe we can?
Yep, sounds good.
There. Awesome. Thanks again.
Thanks.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Give me a
I
second.
see a hand from Jack.
Oh,
Yeah, I'll be super quick. I just wanted to ask, as we continue along with this prototype, would it make sense to keep hosting the actual bits in various people's personal GitHub orgs? Is that fine, or is it worth just, let John know, let me know if we should be putting this in? I know we can do it in SIG cluster lifecycle fairly easily. We could also spawn a new repo in Multicluster. So just let us know.
so we
Okay,
do have.
Go ahead.
Yep, go ahead. So we do have repo, the cluster inventory API repo. So we're waiting for the names to be finalized, and then feel free to contribute, or we can contribute, or anyone can collaborate and contribute and create the PR, and then we can discuss there. But yeah, that's another topic that I was eager to discuss, and we're gonna make a decision today. I mean, we've been pushing this back for a few months now. We're gonna finalize the name. Names are never final. Thank you, Tim. Okay, then at least a name that most of us can be agreed on. Yeah. Let me. And did I answer your question, Jack?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't think it's a super important concern. You guys have done all the heavy lifting over the last year getting to this point, so we appreciate that. Super easy to move stuff over to repos. So let us know. Otherwise, we'll just jam one in our own little sandbox.
Okay. Yep, I'm gonna go into what I want to share with you guys today. I mean, you all today. So this document is written by QJ. Unfortunately, he's unable to join with us today. So we were discussing, the cluster inventory API, which should be cluster scope or namespace scope. So this is mainly for the CRD implementation, of course. So as Tim mentioned, there are lots of pros and different cons on why cluster scope is preferred and not, and then same for namespace scope. So just quickly go over some of the pros that we brainstormed. So for cluster scope, obviously, the name uniqueness is guaranteed by the Kube API server. You cannot go over that. And then it's simpler to. Yep, go ahead.
Is that so? The way I see namespace resources is the name becomes namespace name, right? Like if it's critical that the namespace name, or the unnamespace component of the name is unique, then this is a problem. But is that a problem?
That's a great point. I'm gonna draw that down. So it's simpler. I mean, it's not as big of a problem as you mentioned. Like you say, namespace name is just as unique in the case. That's a great point. So, yep, again, having cluster scope is just a simpler implementation, especially on the alpha stage. Allows you to organize on the same level, so it's treated almost like the node resource. And then it's a little bit friendlier to the cluster managers, and maybe Jack and John can give a little bit of feedback on that. So we don't have to, for the cluster managers, they don't have to care about the namespace of where the cluster inventory API actually lives in.
I see a hand, Tim.
Do
Go
you, when you talk about this as namespace, do you perceive it as one group, one cluster set that happens to span multiple namespaces, or do you perceive it as a control plane for multiple cluster sets?
So could you repeat that? One namespace for
There's two ways.
cluster.
So there's two ways you can look at it in a namespace control plane. Either one control plane, one API server is one cluster set, and some clusters are in namespace foo and some clusters are in namespace bar, and that's fine. Or you look at it as one control plane hosts multiple cluster sets. And I have my dev set and my prod set in the same control plane, and they just use a dev namespace and a prod namespace. Or business unit A, business unit B.
So we always, or at least my interpretation is always the second case, the one control plane, multiple control set, cluster set, and the namespace is, like exactly what you said, more for isolation and security, where one member of the cluster set is not able to access the other one.
Yeah, just I think similar. I've largely been thinking of cluster inventory as a list of things above the cluster set grouping, of which a cluster inventory may contain clusters that are in different non-overlapping cluster sets. So I would think the single control plane. I don't know, and I feel like I want to whiteboard kind of draw out relationships of like if there is a use case for multiple control planes, like how even that would work in like the way that clusters are physically located and things. I don't know.
So Mike kind of spoiled it for me a little bit, and we actually thought of some a problem like this as well. So we were gonna present something like a hybrid solution where, whatever we call this cluster inventory, it is cluster scope, but then we have the mapping of another API, and this may or may not be defined in the kit. I mean, may or may not be something we provide a reference implementation or default implementation for. This mapping API that maps, this namespace to that cluster scope inventory cluster. And then like this hybrid approach gives you a little bit of benefit of both. You have the cluster managers that are able to manage this on a high level, like what Mike just said. But then you also have some of the security benefits where a user is only managing a subset of that cluster set instead of the entire thing. Since we jumped to this, might as well. Did anyone understand the whole thing, or maybe I can go over it from the bottom up. So this was a composite approach that I think Q Jang mainly suggested, and then we sort of agree with him. There's extra complexity to this, of course, like how are we gonna define the mapping? Is the mapping now another thing that we have to submit a CAP for, or is it part of the CAP? But generally, again, is we have our current cluster inventory API to be the cluster scope API. And then it's going to create and managed by cluster manager. again, we're not expecting the users to be creating these objects, so they can remain cluster scope, and they represent each Kubernetes cluster. So the namespace scope, go ahead.
Yeah, I just noticed Jack's comment on chat that this feels like not making a decision, but to me, if we're saying that we think that filtering on namespace is an important use case, then that's probably a sign that we should actually consider namespacing, maybe in a different sense. Like I hadn't personally been thinking about it as multiple cluster sets managed by the same controllers in the same cluster. I have to imagine at the scales we're talking about for most customers, from my perspective, it seems like having multiple controller or APIs is probably fine. But for me, I was thinking more about filtering different use cases and then being able to run controllers across them as something that you gain from namespacing. It seems like that's what we're describing with this composite approach. But the idea that I can either watch the inventory cluster or these mapped inventory clusters starts feeling very like this seems like a complicated API now to integrate with. Now I have to think about these layering, and maybe I'm a lazy developer, but I can see myself deciding to integrate with one layer or assuming that layer is always going to exist. If I want to support namespace, maybe now we always need this map. Like this feels confusing to me.
I agree. It is add quite a bit of complexity to it. That's why it's only a proposal. It's a question mark, and we're getting some feedback. And
This is a good discussion.
Anyone else feels the same? Like we definitely want to draw some feedback.
I think we have a couple hands. Tim.
Yeah, I agree with the complexity. I mean, I'm trying to wrap my head around what it's for. Like, what are people going to model with this? And if I can also ask, when we talk about the users and what the users are going to do, can we actually identify which users? Because I think we're crossing boundaries now. When we start talking about cluster set management, we've got a user who manages the cluster set, the platform, as it were, the platform engineer. And you've got another user who wants to do things with that set, like use it, consume it, deploy services or whatever other APIs we build on top of it. Those are not necessarily the same user, and they won't have the same experience.
Right, exactly. So I think I also have the same question for Gaijin. I think user here might not be well defined. I think user in this case, he want to mention is third party projects. One of the it's more like a consumer. So Argo CD wants to use cluster inventory API. Argo CD wants a certain in this namespace, when a certain amount of users be able to use these certain amount of clusters. So in this case, it's not the end user that's creating the mapping, but it's the consumer of the API that's creating these mappings and setting these isolation. Does that? I will go back and make this diagram a little bit better, but does that help resolve a little bit of the confusion?
I mean, it adds a whole other axis to thinking about this. I don't disagree with the idea that there are sets of clusters that people will want to use. In fact, I think that's something we probably will explore more. I am worried because the Kube API server doesn't offer a whole lot of semantics when it comes to hierarchy of structure of resources. In fact, I was just last week talking about this with Joe Betts, saying, hey, have we ever considered the ability to nest resources in a more natural way, right? Today, we only have namespaces. And his answer was, that's a really interesting idea that API machinery has thought about, but it's very contentious. So I wouldn't hold my breath anytime soon, I guess, even as much as I would like to see it happen. So we should plan for an experience that has one level of nesting, and then we figure out the other use cases on top of that.
Okay, got it. That's a great point as well. So maybe I'm gonna jump. So we sort of okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I had another well, question really. So it ties back to what are the use cases. One of the things I liked about having it at the cluster scope is that it makes it easy for workloads running in a cluster to figure out which cluster sets. So initially, which cluster set singular they are part of, where that's relevant. And I guess we could change that to say the pod needs to look at the cluster information that's in its namespace, but that's not quite the same. I mean, reasoning just about the objects, it seems to me that so instead of not looking at things from a overall cluster set manager perspective, but just from a single cluster, the cluster set or cluster sets plural, it belongs to as a cluster level property. And so that mapped nicely to a cluster scoped object as far as I'm concerned. But maybe we're changing things and it's cluster API that's going to be used to identify things about the cluster, and then cluster inventory is more about management. I don't know. Ryan, go for it.
No, actually, I don't have an answer for your question. I have a separate question.
Yeah, that's fine.
Or maybe related. Is I didn't think through like if it's namespace, how you mentioned that it's easier for user to find out the cluster set. So if it's namespaced, how do they find out the cluster sets? Is that the namespace name is the cluster name they have to match, or I don't actually quite get the use of flow. Anyone have an idea?
Tim, you want to take this, or I can try? So
I mean,
yeah, go ahead.
Please, no, you go ahead, and then I'll see if we're on the same page.
Yeah. So I think the namespace scope is if you're in that namespace and you only have, ability to see these clusters, then automatically you sort of assume, hey, this is a set of clusters that you're working with, versus something that outside of namespace and you can't see it. Tim, go ahead and correct everything I just said.
I mean, there's no correction because we're all in idea space here. So I thought of it as a namespace is the cluster set. And so when you want to list the prod cluster set, you'd say kubectl get clusters -n prod, right? If you want to list the dev cluster set, you -n dev. And you could have any number of cluster sets that are aligned to namespace names. And then if there are things that we have that are associated with specific cluster sets, they would also be namespaced. And if we have things that span cluster sets, right, which isn't inconceivable for something like a CD system, that would be at the cluster level across namespaces, which could use labels or something. So for example, if I had Argo, I want to roll out against dev and then test and then prod, I could do that because dev is one namespace and test is one namespace and prod is another namespace.
So I think the CI/CD use case is making sense. It's kind of the only use case I can really think of where you'd want to talk about multiple cluster sets. Because I think in a lot of cases, you probably specifically not want a controller to span cluster sets, like except for the thing that does the rollouts between. I would probably want dev and prod to have separate controllers for things like job scheduling, right? because I want that isolation to extend to my cluster set level as well. This gets really hard because I could also see cases for like having different namespaces for different types of workloads. Like kind of aligning to the GKE concept we have of like team scopes and in some way, but like being able to create isolation so that I could deploy a controller that, for example, watches all of my HPC oriented clusters, or you know, watches only clusters that I expect to contain financial data or something like that. Like that's another way to break this down. This is that one layer of hierarchy is kind of painful here, because I think it's going to force us to pick, is this about cluster set isolation and supporting multiple cluster sets in a single cluster, or is this about being able to support multi-cluster controllers with RBAC at a subset cluster level, or at a sub cluster set level? Fun.
Yeah, just echo what Jeremy just said. Yeah, this, for example, if I have a cluster that is prod and region in Europe and also running some AI work, how do I find that now? If it's if the namespace is for the prod test and staging, and if I want to find all the clusters in, say, Europe, and find all the clusters in doing AI workload or whatever workload, using namespace, then how can we?
I think labels could work for that.
Yeah, exactly. I would use label instead of using namespace to group these.
For me, namespace would be more about, I want to create access restriction. Like there's like a more formal scoping, not just discovery.
Yeah, for better or for worse, namespace is sort of the crunchy outer shell. And once you get past the crunchy outer shell, you get the soft, gooey middle. So when if I say, you know, Jeremy is my prod administrator, I give Jeremy RBAC access inside my prod namespace, and Jeremy gets to do a whole lot of stuff with that. Not, you know, it's not completely GUI center, but it's not nearly as rigorously defined as between namespaces. And labels then are how you designate metadata for things, and we can move things to fields if we think that they're really fundamental, and you can do field selectors, but labels are a really good first start because everything understands them in Kubernetes space, even though we know they don't scale to, you know, thousands and thousands and thousands, but they do work pretty well. So I would say you'd have a label for your region and a label for your intention and maybe a label for your policy level. You know, maybe you linearize that or maybe it's not linear. And then controllers which were acting on a cluster set would comprehend those labels. If I have policy controller, it would look at the policy level for each cluster and apply policies based on that. Jeremy, you raised an interesting question though. If you want to use namespaces to mean namespaces, right? Like create a namespace and make it appear in all of my clusters, then you can't use namespaces for cluster sets, right? We only get one level of namespacing. We don't have namespaces of namespaces, as much as I wish we did. And I know that's controversial, and if anybody from API Machinery is on here, I'm sorry, but I really wish we had done that. I'm not sure that we want to do that, or if we want to do it in the same control plane. And I'll throw one more thing. I know you want to respond. If we go with a non-namespaced approach, this is a place where things like KCP or vClusters or some other virtualized control plane would sort of shine. We don't really have a standard productionable piece of that, although we have a couple of different implementations in Bud. Sorry, go ahead, Jeremy.
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, you raise a good point. I think part of it is if we have an API here, like a, you know, Kubernetes resource universe that represents your cluster set or set of cluster sets. Like, I think regardless, any of the uses of namespaces we're talking about here aren't namespace as in the same type of names. Like, it's not a namespace within a cluster set that would be reflected within the clusters. Like if a cluster exists in a namespace from the cluster inventory point of view, then that namespace has, I'm struggling with how that namespace would be related to the namespaces that are clusters. And I think what we're actually talking about here is building a layer of hierarchy in namespaces. There's just the namespaces that are outside the clusters and the namespaces within the clusters. And it feels ugly to talk about because it's the same actual namespace concept.
To be really clear, you wouldn't run user-facing workloads in a cluster of this nature. You would have a dedicated control plane for this purpose.
Right. So I guess based on our rules of namespace sameness and cluster sets, what we're basically saying is, to some degree, this cluster exists outside the cluster set, which it would have to if it manages multiple cluster sets. So given that, then I think we're free of tying ourselves from any relationship between the namespace that a cluster is in the inventory and how we control isolation between clusters and namespaces that actually end up getting created in those clusters.
So Jeremy, I was following along all the way up until your last big sentence. So I understand I understand what you mentioned exactly, how this is now outside of the cluster set. So, but then you're like, okay, this is why. Could you repeat that, please, for my
So
understanding?
yeah, I'm just saying that because this cluster is outside of the cluster set, the namespaces that we're talking about here when we group clusters don't necessarily relate directly or even at all to the namespaces that end up getting created in the clusters that are within the cluster set.
Okay.
That does lock us into a specific pattern of needing that hub cluster to manage it, rather than potentially having like an out of band control plane.
Can you say more? I'm not sure I see the lock-in.
Yeah, I guess like, so the like namespaced thing where you're like overloading the semantic meaning of a namespace for where the CR is installed. I get what you're saying, where that makes sense in a like management cluster. I had been thinking previously of like installing this cluster profile or whatever CRD inside each of the member clusters and having it consumed by a control plane, rather than like writing the definitions of like managing definitions of this in separate namespaces in a hub or management cluster.
So each cluster in the cluster set would have an inventory cluster for each other cluster. So basically, it all have a view of cluster set. Is that what you're thinking?
Yes, and that was, from my perspective, I think that was part of the reason why the whole like naming mismatch happened, was because you're looking at like a cluster is likely defining a single thing representing itself within itself, and then your external controller is like consuming that one resource to learn things about it, like the cluster properties, its name, its intended cluster set membership.
How much do you trust each cluster? Like, does each cluster get to define its own citizenship, or do you have a control plane that exists outside of any one cluster? Because clusters do get attacked, right?
That's a good question. Yeah.
That was a big part of my thinking all along. Is I don't trust clusters, right? Now I deal with a cluster that's in a store, right? You walk into a Chick-fil-A with a neon vest on, and you just sort of walk in the back, stick a USB drive in the computer. You own that cluster, right? And they'll probably let you do it because you're wearing a neon vest and carrying a clipboard. And now you own that cluster. That really cannot become a horizontal attack. You can't attack. You should not be able to attack other clusters from that. I hold that as sort of the highest principle.
That makes sense. I could definitely see needing some kind of like handshake type thing where, yeah, you can't just like unilaterally declare I'm part of this.
But even if you don't do that, I think what was it Tim that mentioned it? Sorry, I have my screen. I think it's more like, oh, I'm gonna lie about how much resource ability I have. I have all the resource. Now give me all your workload, and now I can steal data and stuff like that. Maybe an attack like that as well.
Yeah, if there were easy answers, we would have solved this already. Like you're right. At some point, you do trust something from the cluster, but trust but verify or something applies here, right? If I have a control plane that says, hey, this Chick-fil-A store has 3 nodes and 12 gigs of memory, then it reports 200 gigs of memory. Well, I don't know if I should believe it.
Yeah, I mean, I would actually err on the side of having the controller trust as little from each cluster as it possibly can, or that kind of as a principle. Like, if there's anything that should be known by the central authority, I would go with the central authority's version. And if they're disagreeing, consider the cluster broken.
Mike, any more feedback on this or? So going back to if this should be a cluster scope or namespace scope. I guess we're not ready to make a decision now, but I'm getting the sense that having it as a namespace scope at least it gives us extra flexibility in the future for security isolation. Is that the common consensus, the conclusion that I can draw from this discussion?
Well, I think we have to decide first what we mean by namespace scope. So I think first of all, having the stock shared is a really good starting point. For me, it's like maybe we break it down. It's namespace scoped as in isolation within a cluster set, and then or it's namespace scoped as in multiple cluster sets in the same management cluster. And then I think it would be good to go through and actually drill down on use cases for each practically, because even if we're going namespace, we have to pick one of those because they're competing purposes, they're competing uses for the namespace for that layer of hierarchy. But I think there's a lot here. It would be good to, for me at least, it would be good to kind of think about this for a bit, and maybe the offline doc collaboration is a good place to do that and flesh out some of these ideas.
Right. I don't know what. Yeah, I don't know why editing is not available, but yes. So feel free to add in comments and suggestions, and then we'll modify the doc as we go.
Sometimes
And
you
then-
need to re-sign in to docs, and then it, like when you're anonymous, it won't let you actually save things.
Right. But this doc was created by QJang, so I know I don't have permission on it. I think we just forgot to change the okay, so we'll come back to this discussion.
Jack, did you have a hand?
I just wanted to suggest we could actually POC. So in terms of your question, Jeremy, about what does it mean to be namespace scoped, we could POC both flavors on CAPI, on Cluster API. Cluster API is gonna feel more native on the second one, but we can feel like we can see what it feels like to be non-native, so to speak. It's not that much dev time.
Awesome. POCs are
So
always nice.
okay, cool. So in the next couple of weeks, I'll reach out maybe to you, Mike and Jeremy, and see if we can define what those two options might look like, and we can do two different CRDs and see how they feel.
And Mike, one of the things you mentioned, I think it was you, Mike, pardon me if I'm wrong. One of the things you mentioned at KubeCon was not all namespaces want to be sameness across a cluster set, right? Where, just thinking ahead, where would we denote that? Where do we designate this namespace but not that namespace? And does that influence our decision here about the cluster set control plane?
Note that that namespace would be a different namespace than the namespace we're talking about here for namespacing.
We need a namespace for namespaces.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a good question. It's a very good question.
Yeah, just want to echo what Jeremy said. I think these two are two different type of namespaces. That makes, if the cluster inventory API is namespaced, that makes it feels like they needs to be nested namespace to have the real namespace projected to the member clusters or whatever managed clusters. That's one downside of the namespace scope cluster inventory, at least in my mental model. It's you have to namespace those clusters, and then within this each cluster you have a namespace, so that namespace will be a nested namespace inside that cluster set namespace conceptually. At least that's my mental model, but I don't know how to, if that's something we have the same mental model. I think we are still at pretty early stage.
Yeah, my model's a bit different. I just kind of see these same, though they have the same name, I see these concepts of namespaces just kind of being unrelated. And maybe that's wrong as well. It's certainly not simple here.
Yeah, I can see the reason I nested them is if they're unrelated and they are, but they do have a relationship between these two, it becomes an all to all. So this namespace that is, I don't know how to the name, this namespace is supposed to project into the member clusters, and this is the cluster set namespace. And these two becomes we can't somehow needs to have a relation between them. Need to say, oh, these namespaces can be placed into that cluster set. So there's some way we need to have a relationship between these. So it's kind of like the relational database or the documentary database. How do you loosely define them or tightly couple them into it? Either way doesn't feel very natural to me. Yeah, that just initial thought.
Well, thank you. Yep, go ahead.
One more thing is about the multiple cluster set. That's also a part I'm not too sure about, the multiple cluster set, or we can say our control plane is only for one cluster set. And then actually I'm not 100% sure what does cluster set mean up here. If we have a group of prod, a group of testing and staging, are they three different? Do they have to be three different cluster sets, or they can be one just with labels to differentiate them?
Have to be
valid models.
I think they're both valid. I think there are trade-offs. We've defined cluster set very loosely, right? It's a set of clusters under common administration. I certainly know people who manage their dev and their prod very differently. And I know people who don't, right? Google has one environment that we run everything in. Not everybody that I talk to as customers works that way. In fact, very few people do.
And I think that there's the namespace sameness complicates things, because if you want to run dev and prod in the same cluster set, which of course is possible, it necessitates that either namespaces mean the same thing across both, and that's essentially a big risk for connecting dev and prod services together accidentally, or it means that like promotion from dev to prod involves renaming a whole bunch of things that also hopefully works. So I think, like, when I think about it, I tend to skew towards the different cluster sets for environments, which forces any linkage to be very purposeful. But of course, there are many ways to do things, and I'm not sure here that we want to dictate one or the other. But this is a good use case. It's really the only use case that really comes to mind where I think you would want a controller to span multiple cluster sets, because if you have CI/CD, you want to be able to have a controller manage rollouts between those cluster sets.
That's also these are mostly from like the all of your stuff is in a like cluster set group. There's also the like cluster proliferation inside large organizations problem, where you have different business units or teams that each manage a group of clusters under their own administration and need to talk to resources which may live in a different cluster set, which is a different team's concept of sameness. Like my app named web over on team A may be completely different than my app named web in the web namespace over on team B. So that's where it's like a logical grouping, which organizations can be structured differently. Some organizations have that global, some organizations have that much more segmented. But like both of those organizations and the teams within them need to do something like geo redundancy between different clusters and have some way to communicate with the other clusters. And some of this is totally beyond the scope of anything that exists or is possible today.
Okay, we have 5 minutes. Any other additional feedback? Feel free to share in the doc as well. I put the doc in the doc in the our meeting notes. So the most challenging topic of all, we've been discussing the naming for quite a while now. So it's still the polling numbers. The results are here. Cluster profile seems to be winning. Cluster record, inventory cluster. They're both quite close, to be honest. It's a matter of 2 or 3 votes. There's no sort of concrete choice that the community wants. Like my personal opinion is I didn't really like the result, but the result is cluster profile. It's a clear. It's not the clear winner, but it's the winner now. I really like inventory clusters because we went through KubeCon, Kev, Repo. We all use the word inventory, and I love cluster inventory. The word, it described exactly what we're looking for. And unfortunately, Jack is right. Cluster inventory meant a list of items usually. So I personally think like a quick fix is inventory cluster. Sounds pretty awkward, of course, but we at least we maintain that consistency to the community, and our discussion point has always been inventory cluster inventory. If we switch to something like cluster profile, that's maybe it's okay. Maybe we can get behind it, rally behind it. But I just want to one final ask to the community: are we go ahead with going with the polling here, and then I can update our. I already have a cap open, cap PR open, ready for this naming change. So I just want one final feedback. And Tim, I never heard your opinion on this. so any feedback?
You should know better than to let me name things. I'm a big fan of the sort of Go ethos of don't stutter. And so if the API group designates the scoping of it, then the noun can be much simpler. So, if the API group indicates that this is the multi-cluster inventory API, then it doesn't need to be inventory cluster. It can just be cluster. And I appreciate that the word cluster has sort of been laid claim to by cluster API. That doesn't actually rule it out, right? You can have the same kind in different API groups. It's just a wee bit more confusing.
But it's not only confusing, even usability is quite difficult. Like you must have went into a situation where 2 of the CRDs name, and then you're typing in the terminal, and then is it this one or the other one? Sorry, go ahead. Was it Jeremy?
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing actually to both. I think I like cluster because cluster.inventory.multicluster is descriptive, but it is true that kubectl get clusters then becomes ambiguous if you're using cluster API. So I think that's, you know, something that we should figure out. But really what I was going to say is like, we can definitely run this poll more. We can leave it open. We can share it more. At the end of the day, I think we will end up with something that at least half the people, hopefully slightly less, are like not super enthused with because it's just, there's too much here. But no matter what we end up with, it can still be the cluster inventory API, right? Just like the about API, where we talk about cluster properties, like they're not cluster abouts, right? Like we can call it, we don't need to rename the branding for the API, so don't worry about that. But I think, you know, resource naming is tricky.
Okay, with that being said, I think we're gonna, I went the poll for a long time, and this is the second time we got the same results. We're cluster profile winning, so I think I'm gonna go with the cluster profile for now in my KPR. So that's, and unless someone jumps out and have a real strong objection, please feel free to raise it in the Kubernetes Slack. That's all I have for today. Thank you all.
Thank you. We had two more hands. Looks
Yeah.
like Jack and Tim. I cannot tell who's first.
Tim was first.
Tim removed
right.
his.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
I guess so.
I just wanted to make one clarifying point. It is true you say, Jeremy, about if you're using CAPI and we use cluster is definitely a much more elegant name. I agree, but it's not just that you have to worry about the disambiguating API prefix if you're using cluster API. The whole point to me of defining the standard API is to unlock solutions at the sort of front end that are going to consume this new thing that we're defining. And so we would need to make sure that all of that ecosystem develops around a fully qualified resource name if we use cluster, because they're going to be programming against this and not cluster API, and they might have a solution that someone adopts in their CAPI environment and suddenly it breaks because there's that ambiguous nature. So I think that's totally fair. We would just want to be super, I'm not sure that that's a common gesture for folks developing on top of Kubernetes to fully qualify all of that stuff all the time, because you don't always have to do that. So hopefully that makes sense what I said.
I totally hear that. And also we're 10 years old and everybody's using up all the good words. Like collisions are inevitable. It's something the ecosystem at large is going to have to learn to deal with.
+1.
It starts to make more sense when you think of the creation process, where cluster API, you're actually creating the cluster. Here, you're really creating the profile, the description of the cluster.
I think a lot of community member agrees with you, Mike, since you won both times, so might have to go with that for now.
Tim, I do hope when you run into conversations about people wanting to reuse pod in some other fully qualified notion that you strike that down with a sword. But
I mean,
other than pod, I think it's fine.
I mean, it's I think it comes down to sort of authority. Like I don't actually own cluster API, right? And so I can't, I back it up. Pod is such a core primitive in Kubernetes. You can't not have it. You can not have cluster API. Pod has got 100% adoption. Every single Kubernetes cluster has pod.
Appreciate everyone. I'm really glad that we're talking about this. Got a lot of perspective, and it feels like we're working together to make something that's gonna like actually solve this use case. So yeah, it's exciting. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks folks who led discussions today. This was great. Let's catch up on docs and add comments and thoughts and debate, and then 2 weeks from now maybe we'll have more time for this to kind of soak. We can keep this discussion going.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thank you. Have a great week.